Colorado Territory, 1875. The vast grasslands near Pikes Peak stretched out before Isaac Vance like a rolling sea of amber, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across his modest ranch. At 26, Isaac had already lived a lifetime of solitude. His weathered face belied his youth, though underneath the grit and hardened exterior remained the handsome features that once made young ladies in town flutter. His clear blue eyes still held an intensity that could cut through a man's pretenses, even if they rarely met another's gaze these days. 15 years alone had taught Isaac one truth: attachment brought only suffering. The frontier claimed everything he'd ever loved, first his parents to fever, then his brother to a ranch dispute gone violent. He'd been only 11 when they buried his family, leaving him to be raised by his uncle, who taught him ranching before drinking himself to death 5 years ago. "A man stands alone out here," Isaac muttered to his horse, Shadow, as they rode the perimeter of his land. "That's how you survive." His 2,000 acres of grazing land and the modest but sturdy cabin he'd built himself were all he needed. The small herd of cattle and 3 good horses provided his living. The nearest town, Silverdale, was a half-day's ride away, and he visited only when supplies ran low. When the loneliness crept in during winter nights, he reminded himself that solitude was safety. People complicated things, women especially. Every year on the anniversary of his family's deaths, Isaac rode into Silverdale, drank himself numb at the Antler Saloon, and rode back to face another year alone. He'd built his world this way, predictable, controlled, and empty of the messiness human connection brought. It was enough. It had to be. That evening, as Isaac sat on his cabin porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple, a distant dust cloud caught his attention. Visitors never came this way, especially not with night approaching. He reached for the Winchester rifle leaning against the wall, eyes narrowing at the approaching wagon. As the vehicle drew closer, Isaac stood, rifle resting against his shoulder. The wagon was driven by Hank Willis, Silverdale's general store owner, an unusual courier for anything headed toward the Vance ranch. Beside him sat a young woman, her posture straight despite what must have been a jolting ride across the rough terrain. "Evening, Isaac," Hank called as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "Got someone here, says she's expected." Isaac's brow furrowed. Expected? By whom? The young woman glanced from Hank to Isaac, confusion crossing her delicate features. She was startlingly beautiful, with golden blonde hair neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet, wearing a blue traveling dress that had seen better days but was clearly once fine. She couldn't have been more than 20. "By you, sir," she said, her voice carrying a slight Eastern accent. "I'm Ruby Daniels, your mail-order bride." Isaac nearly dropped his rifle. "My what?" "There must be some mistake," Ruby said, her cheeks flushing. "I have correspondence from an I. Vance of Silverdale County, Colorado Territory." Isaac shook his head. "Ma'am, I never sent for any bride." Hank cleared his throat awkwardly. "Thing is, Isaac, there's another Vance about 50 miles east. Isaiah Vance. Runs the Mercantile in Cottonwood Springs. Reckon the letters got mixed up at the territorial post." Ruby's face fell, her gloved hands twisting in her lap. "Oh, I see. I'll take her to Cottonwood Springs tomorrow," Hank offered, though his expression suggested the last thing he wanted was another day's journey. Night was falling, the temperature dropping rapidly as it did in the high country. The next town was hours away. Isaac looked at the woman, Ruby, and saw exhaustion etched on her face despite her dignified bearing. Something stirred in him, an unfamiliar sense of responsibility. "It's too late to travel further tonight. You can stay here. I'll sleep in the barn." Ruby looked at him with wary gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Vance." As Hank helped Ruby down from the wagon and unloaded her single trunk, Isaac felt a strange discomfort. He hadn't prepared his home for guests, especially not female ones, in over 15 years. The cabin was clean enough but sparse, functional rather than welcoming. "I'll be back day after tomorrow," Hank said, climbing back onto his wagon seat. "Got deliveries in the other direction tomorrow." Before Isaac could protest, Hank had turned his wagon and was heading back toward town, leaving Isaac alone with a strange woman who was supposed to be someone else's bride. Ruby Daniels, 19 years old and over 1,000 miles from her Philadelphia home, stood on Isaac's porch clutching her small carpet bag, wondering how her carefully laid plans had gone so terribly wrong. "It's not much," Isaac said gruffly, pushing open the cabin door. "But it's warm." The cabin was indeed simple. One main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a small cooking area, and a curtained-off sleeping space. Everything was orderly but utilitarian, like a man who saw his home as merely a place to eat and sleep. "It's lovely," Ruby said automatically, though the words seemed to confuse Isaac. "The bed's through there." He gestured to the curtain. "I changed the sheets last month, but I can put fresh ones on." Ruby smiled despite herself. "That would be appreciated, Mr. Vance." As Isaac busied himself preparing the cabin, Ruby stood awkwardly, unsure of her place in this unexpected situation. She had left everything behind in Philadelphia. Her domineering aunt, the unsuitable suitor who wouldn't take no for an answer, the gossip that followed her father's financial ruin and subsequent death. The advertisements for frontier brides had promised a fresh start, a life where her past wouldn't matter. Now she was in a stranger's home, with no clear path forward. "Are you hungry?" Isaac asked, interrupting her thoughts. Ruby nodded, suddenly aware of how long it had been since she'd eaten. "Yes, thank you." Isaac moved with surprising efficiency for a man and used to company, heating stew from his dinner and cutting fresh bread. He set the table and then stood back, as if unsure whether to join her. "Please," Ruby gestured to the other chair. "It's your home." They ate in uncomfortable silence, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against bowls and the crackle of the fire. Isaac kept his eyes on his food, as though looking at her directly might turn him to stone. "Mr. Vance," Ruby finally ventured, "I'm terribly sorry for the inconvenience. I'll be out of your way as soon as possible." Isaac looked up then, his blue eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. "It's no trouble," but they both knew it was. His entire existence seemed designed around the absence of others. After dinner, Ruby insisted on washing the dishes while Isaac prepared a bedroll for himself in the barn. When he returned to collect a lantern, he found her standing by his small bookshelf, examining the worn volumes. "You like to read?" she observed. Isaac shrugged. "Winters are long. Not much else to do." Ruby traced a finger along the spine of a book of poetry. "My father loved Wordsworth." The memory of her father, his gentle voice reading poems by the fire before illness and financial ruin took him, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Isaac shifted uncomfortably. "Take whatever books you want. For the night, I mean." "Thank you," Ruby said, composing herself. She selected a volume and retreated behind the curtain to the bed, listening as Isaac's footsteps receded toward the barn. In the darkness of the strange cabin, Ruby finally allowed herself to cry silently. Everything she'd planned had fallen apart in an instant. The careful letters exchanged with Isaiah Vance, who described himself as a successful businessman seeking a refined wife, had led her here, to the wrong Vance, a man who clearly wanted nothing to do with her or any woman. Tomorrow would bring another long journey, and what then? What if this Isaiah didn't want her either, now that she'd arrived without warning? She had barely enough money for a return ticket to Philadelphia, and nothing to return to if she did. Outside in the barn, Isaac spread his bedroll in a clean stall, acutely aware of the woman sleeping in his house. Her presence had disturbed something in him, like a stone dropped in still water. It wasn't just her beauty, though that was undeniable. It was the glimpse of vulnerability he'd seen when she mentioned her father, the quiet dignity with which she faced her misfortune. For the first time in years, Isaac thought of his mother, her gentle hands, her quiet strength. The memory both comforted and wounded him. He'd spent 15 years building walls around such memories, around the capacity for hurt that came with caring for others. As he drifted off to sleep, Isaac told himself that by this time tomorrow, Ruby Daniels would be gone, and his life would return to its reliable solitude. The odd feeling in his chest, something between anxiety and anticipation, would fade, and all would be as it was. He was wrong. Morning arrived with a spring snowstorm, the kind that swept down from the mountains without warning, turning the world white and impassable. Isaac awoke to 6 inches of fresh snow and more falling heavily, the wind howling around the barn corners. When he trudged through the snow to the cabin, he found Ruby already awake, building up the fire with surprising competence. "Good morning," she said, straightening up. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, catching the firelight like spun gold. She'd changed into a simple gray dress, practical but becoming. Storm came. Isaac said unnecessarily, stamping snow from his boots. Won't be traveling today. Ruby nodded, accepting this news with remarkable composure. I noticed. I hope you don't mind that I started the fire. No, Isaac said, oddly touched by her consideration. That's good. The day stretched before them, an expanse of forced proximity neither had anticipated. Isaac busied himself with necessary chores, checking on the livestock in the barn, bringing in more firewood, securing what might blow away in the wind. Ruby, determined not to be idle, found ways to make herself useful, sweeping the cabin floor and organizing the kitchen shelves. By midday, the storm showed no signs of abating. Isaac returned from the barn, snow crusting his coat and hat, to find Ruby at his stove, stirring something that filled the cabin with a mouth-watering aroma. I hope you don't mind, she said, glancing over her shoulder. I found some vegetables and made soup. Isaac stood awkwardly in his own doorway, struck by the domestic tableau before him. You didn't have to cook. I wanted to earn my keep, Ruby said simply. Besides, I enjoy cooking. My father and I often couldn't afford to cook, so I learned young. As they sat down to eat, Isaac found himself asking, What brought you out here? To marry a stranger? Ruby considered her answer carefully. After my father died, I had few options in Philadelphia. My aunt took me in, but made it clear I was a burden. There was a man, a business associate of my late father's, who offered marriage, but his intentions were, she paused, less than honorable. When I saw the advertisement, it seemed like Providence. A fresh start. The frontier's no place for a city woman, Isaac said, though without conviction. Ruby's chin lifted slightly. People can adapt, Mr. Vance. Necessity is an excellent teacher. Something in her quiet determination reminded Isaac of himself at a younger age, facing the frontier's harsh realities with nothing but stubborn will. He found himself telling her about his cattle operation, the challenges of ranching alone, the satisfaction of building something from nothing. As the day wore on, their conversation came easier. Ruby told him about growing up in Philadelphia, her father's bookshop, the garden she'd tended behind their modest home. Isaac, to his own surprise, shared stories of his early days on the ranch with his brother, the herd they'd built together before the tragedy. I'm sorry about your brother, Ruby said softly when Isaac fell silent after mentioning Matthew's death. It was a long time ago, Isaac replied, though the pain in his eyes suggested otherwise. Loss doesn't diminish with time, Ruby observed. We just learn to carry it differently. Their eyes met across the table, a moment of unexpected understanding passing between them. Isaac looked away first, unaccustomed to being seen so clearly. By evening, the storm had intensified. After dinner, they sat by the fire, the howling wind making the cabin seem smaller, more intimate. Ruby had found his mother's old sewing basket and was mending a tear in one of his shirts, her slender fingers working the needle with practiced ease. You don't have to do that, Isaac said, watching her from his chair. I know, Ruby replied without looking up. But idle hands make for a restless mind. Isaac wondered what thoughts she was keeping at bay. Worry about her future, perhaps, or regret for the journey that had led her astray. This Isaiah Vance, Isaac found himself asking. What did he tell you about himself? Ruby's hand stilled. He wrote that he was 32, a merchant with a thriving business. Educated, church-going. Looking for a wife who could help him socially, as well as keep a home. She paused. He mentioned wanting children right away. Isaac nodded, creating a mental picture of this other Vance. Older, established, conventional. Everything Isaac was not. And that's what you want. To be a merchant's wife? Have children right away? Ruby considered the question seriously. I want security, she finally said. And yes, a family someday. But mainly, I want a place where I belong. Where I'm valued for who I am, not just what I can provide. The honesty of her answer struck Isaac deeply. Wasn't that what everyone wanted, deep down? Even him, though he'd buried that desire under years of self-imposed isolation? You'll find it, he said, surprising himself with his certainty. Ruby smiled at him then, a genuine smile that transformed her face from merely beautiful to radiant. Thank you, Isaac. It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something shifted between them in that moment. A small but significant crack in the wall he'd built around himself. That night, Lying in the barn listening to the storm, Isaac fought against unfamiliar emotions. Ruby would leave when the weather cleared. She would marry her merchant, have her family, create her life elsewhere. This brief intersection of their paths meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. Yet he couldn't stop thinking about the way firelight caught in her hair, or how her eyes reflected understanding rather than pity when he spoke of his losses. For the first time in 15 years, Isaac allowed himself to wonder what it might be like to not be alone. The storm lasted 3 days, forcing Isaac and Ruby into a domestic arrangement neither had anticipated. They fell into a rhythm, Isaac handling the outdoor chores, Ruby keeping the cabin warm and meals prepared. In the evenings, they talked, tentatively at first, then with growing ease. Ruby learned about Isaac's small herd of prized cattle, his plans to expand the north pasture, his favorite horse Shadow who had been with him since the animal was a colt. Isaac discovered Ruby's love of gardening, her talent for sketching, her surprising knowledge of business from helping her father with his bookshop accounts. On the third evening, as they sat by the fire, Ruby working on a sketch of the mountains visible from Isaac's window, she asked, "Don't you ever get lonely out here?" Isaac stared into the flames. "Got used to it, I suppose." "That's not the same as not being lonely," Ruby observed gently. Isaac looked at her then, really looked at her, allowing himself to see beyond her beauty to the perceptiveness in her gaze. "Why'd you really come west, Ruby?" "The whole truth." Ruby set down her pencil, considering her answer. "The man I mentioned, my father's business associate. He became insistent after my father died. My aunt encouraged the match, despite knowing he was not a good man. When he threatened to ruin what was left of my family's reputation if I refused him, I realized I needed to disappear completely." Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. "So I answered the advertisement, sold my mother's jewelry for the train fare, and left everything behind." The vulnerability of her confession stirred something protective in Isaac. "He can't find you here." "No," Ruby agreed with a small smile. "I suppose that's one benefit of arriving at the wrong ranch." The following morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Isaac stood on his porch, looking at the pristine white landscapes stretching to the mountains, knowing the time had come for Ruby to leave. When Hank Willis's wagon appeared on the horizon around midday, Isaac felt a heaviness settle in his chest. Ruby emerged from the cabin in her traveling clothes, her small trunk packed and waiting. "Thank you for your hospitality," she said formally, as though trying to rebuild the distance between them that the storm had erased. "It was no trouble," Isaac replied, equally stilted. They stood awkwardly as Hank's wagon approached, neither saying what hovered unspoken between them. That something had changed in these 3 days, something neither had expected. "Well now, survived the storm, did you?" Hank called cheerfully as he pulled up. "Roads are clear enough to get to Cottonwood Springs before nightfall if we leave now." Ruby nodded, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I'm ready." Isaac helped load her trunk onto the wagon, then offered his hand to help her up. Their fingers touched, and for a moment, neither moved. Then Ruby squeezed his hand gently before climbing onto the seat. "Goodbye, Isaac," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." Isaac stood in the yard watching the wagon grow smaller in the distance, an unfamiliar emptiness expanding inside him. The cabin, which had always been his sanctuary, suddenly seemed achingly empty. That evening, as Isaac sat alone by his fire, the silence that had once been comfortable now felt oppressive. He found himself glancing at the chair where Ruby had sat, remembering the sound of her laughter, the thoughtful questions she'd asked, the way she'd made his isolated existence feel less lonely. 2 days passed, each hour crawling by with excruciating slowness. Isaac threw himself into ranch work, exhausting his body in hopes of quieting his mind. But thoughts of Ruby persisted. What was she doing now? Had she met the other Vance? Was he kind to her? Did she miss? No. Isaac cut off that thought before it could form. Of course she didn't miss him or this primitive ranch. She was probably already planning her wedding to the merchant, grateful to have reached her intended destination. On the third day after Ruby's departure, Isaac rode into Silverdale for supplies, telling himself it was merely coincidence that his usual monthly trip had come due. At the general store, he loaded his wagon with flour, coffee, and ammunition, studiously avoiding Hank Willis's knowing gaze. "Heard you might be wondering about that girl." Hank finally said as Isaac paid for his purchases. Isaac kept his expression neutral. Just hope she found what she was looking for. Hank leaned on the counter. Funny thing about that. Got word from Cottonwood Springs yesterday. Seems this Isaiah Vance took one look at her and said there'd been a mistake. Claimed he never sent for any bride. Isaac's head snapped up. What? Telegraph operator in Cottonwood says the man turned white as a sheet when she arrived. Turns out he's already got a wife in Denver. Been running some kind of scam. Sounds like writing to women back east. Where is she now? Isaac demanded, his heart pounding. Staying at the boarding house in Cottonwood, last I heard. Woman who runs it took pity on her. Gave her work in exchange for room and board until she figures out what to do next. Isaac left his supplies sitting on the counter and strode out to his horse. Within moments, he was galloping toward Cottonwood Springs, a town he hadn't visited in years, with no clear plan beyond finding Ruby. The journey took nearly 4 hours of hard riding. By the time Isaac reached Cottonwood Springs, the sun was setting. The town was larger than Silverdale, boasting a proper hotel, several saloons, and a main street lined with businesses. Isaac located the boarding house, a neat white building with green shutters, and tied his horse at the hitching post outside. His heart raced as he knocked on the door, suddenly aware he had no idea what he would say when he saw Ruby. The door opened to reveal a matronly woman with graying hair and suspicious eyes. "Help you?" she asked, taking in Isaac's dusty clothes and trail-worn appearance. "I'm looking for Ruby Daniels," he said, removing his hat. "I heard she might be staying here." The woman's eyes narrowed further. "And who might you be?" "Isaac Vance. She stayed at my ranch during the snowstorm last week." "There was a mix-up with—" "I know all about the mix-up," the woman interrupted. "Poor girl traveled all this way only to discover she'd been deceived. That snake Isaiah Vance has a wife in Denver and God knows where else." She studied Isaac's face. "You're the rancher she was delivered to by mistake?" Isaac nodded. "Is she here? I'd like to speak with her." The woman, Mrs. Holbrook, she eventually introduced herself as, regarded him suspiciously for another moment before stepping back. "Wait in the parlor. I'll see if Miss Daniels wishes to receive you." Isaac paced the small parlor, hat in hand, rehearsing what he might say. The minutes stretched endlessly until finally he heard footsteps on the stairs. He turned as Ruby appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of surprise and something he couldn't quite name. "Isaac," she said softly, "what are you doing here?" She looked beautiful and sad, her golden hair simply braided, wearing a plain dark dress that must have been borrowed. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before. "I heard what happened," Isaac said, taking a step toward her. "With the other Vance." Ruby's face fell. "Yes. It seems I've had a streak of terrible luck with men named Vance." "Not all of us," Isaac said before he could stop himself. Ruby's eyes widened slightly. "Isaac, why did you come?" The question hung between them, demanding truth. Isaac took a deep breath. "Because in 3 days, you made me remember what it's like not to be alone. Because my cabin feels empty without you in it. Because," he faltered, and used to such declarations. "Because I can't stop thinking about you." Ruby took a tentative step forward. "I've thought of you too. Of your ranch. It felt more like home in those few days than anywhere has since my father died." "It could be," Isaac said, the words coming from someplace deep inside him he'd thought long closed. "Your home, I mean, if you want it. Are you offering me employment?" Ruby asked carefully. Isaac shook his head. "No, I'm asking if you might consider a different arrangement than what brought you west. One based on what we've already begun to feel, not on letters between strangers." Understanding dawned in Ruby's eyes. "Isaac Vance, are you proposing to me?" "Badly, it seems," he admitted with a sheepish smile. "I'm out of practice with people, let alone this." Ruby's lips curved upward. "You're doing fine." "I don't have much," Isaac continued, gaining confidence from her smile. "Just the ranch and the cattle. It's a hard life, especially for someone raised in the city. But it could be a good life, Ruby. Together." Ruby moved closer until she stood directly before him. "I didn't come west looking for luxury, Isaac. I came looking for a place to belong. Someone who would see me for who I am." Her voice softened. "I think I may have found that, just not where I expected." Isaac reached for her hand, marveling at how small it felt in his own. "I can't promise to be perfect at this. 15 years alone leaves marks. But I can promise to try every day to be worthy of you." That's all anyone can ask, Ruby said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. And I promise the same. When Isaac kissed her, it was gentle and tentative, the kiss of a man rediscovering a part of himself long buried. Ruby responded with a sweetness that made his heart ache with newfound possibility. They were married 3 days later in Cottonwood Springs' small church, with Mrs. Holbrook and the local minister as witnesses. The ceremony was simple, but as Isaac placed a ring on Ruby's finger, his mother's, which he'd kept all these years in a box beneath his bed, he felt a sense of rightness that transcended the hasty arrangements. The journey back to the ranch took on the quality of a homecoming, though Ruby had spent only 3 days there before. As they crested the final hill and the cabin came into view, nestled against the backdrop of mountains, Ruby squeezed Isaac's hand. "It's beautiful," she said. "Our home." The words sent a thrill through Isaac. Our home. Not his solitary outpost against the world, but a place they would build together. Spring arrived in full force during those first weeks of their marriage, the land greening and wildflowers carpeting the meadows. Isaac watched in amazement as Ruby transformed the cabin with small touches. Curtains fashioned from fabric bought in Silverdale, a vegetable garden planted beside the house, wildflowers arranged in jars on the table. Their nights were a revelation, the tenderness between them healing wounds neither had fully acknowledged. Isaac discovered that touch, after 15 years of absence, could be a language of its own, expressing what his unpracticed words could not yet say. They settled into rhythms together, Isaac teaching Ruby about ranch life, Ruby bringing order and beauty to spaces long neglected. She learned to ride, to help with the cattle, to navigate the challenges of frontier life with a determination that continually surprised and impressed him. In turn, Isaac found himself softening, laughing more, seeing his land through her appreciative eyes. "I've been thinking," he said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, "about expanding the house come fall, adding a proper bedroom, maybe a small room beside it." Ruby leaned against his shoulder. "For what purpose?" Isaac's arm tightened around her. "Well, I thought, that is, if you wanted, someday we might need more space. For family." Ruby turned to face him, her eyes alight with joy. "Are you saying you want children, Isaac Vance?" "With you," he confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. "Only with you." Their kiss sealed the promise of a future neither had dared imagine months before. As summer ripened into autumn, the ranch prospered. Isaac's cattle fetched good prices at market, allowing for the planned expansion of the house. Ruby's garden yielded abundantly, her preserves filling the shelves for winter. They worked side by side, building something neither could have created alone. On the anniversary of his family's deaths, a day Isaac had always spent drinking alone in Silverdale, they rode together to the small fenced plot on a hill where his parents and brother were buried. Ruby stood quietly beside him as he introduced her, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "They would have loved you," he told her as they rode back to the ranch. "Especially my mother. I wish I could have known them," Ruby said. "But I'm grateful they raised a man who could love so deeply, even after so much loss." That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Ruby took Isaac's hand and placed it on her abdomen. "I have something to tell you," she whispered. Isaac went still, understanding dawning slowly. "Ruby, are you?" She nodded, her smile visible even in the dim light. "The doctor in Silverdale confirmed it yesterday. We'll have a child by spring." Isaac gathered her close, overwhelmed by joy and protective love. The emptiness that had defined him for 15 years was gone, filled now with a family of his own making. Winter came early that year, snow blanketing the ranch by late October. But inside the expanded cabin, with its new bedroom and the small nursery being prepared next door, warmth prevailed. On the coldest nights, Isaac would watch Ruby sleeping beside him, her hand resting protectively over her growing belly, and marvel at how completely his life had transformed. "I used to believe the frontier was no place for love," he confessed to her one night as they sat by the fire. "That out here, a man survived by staying alone, needing nothing and no one." Ruby nestled closer in his arms. "And now I know that's the surest way to die, even while your heart's still beating," he said, pressing his lips to her forehead. "You saved me, Ruby Vance, from a fate worse than any the frontier could deliver, a life without love." "We saved each other," Ruby corrected gently. And now we'll build something new together. In April, as the first wildflowers began to bloom across the thawing pastures, their daughter was born, Catherine Grace Vance, named for Isaac's mother and Ruby's. As Isaac held his newborn child while sitting beside his exhausted but radiant wife, he knew with perfect clarity that his 15 years of isolation had not been a choice for survival, but a waiting period. Waiting for this woman, this child, this life he'd never believed possible. The ranch that had once been his fortress against connection became the center of a growing community. Ruby's warmth and Isaac's newfound openness drew neighbors who had previously kept their distance. Children came, 2 more daughters and finally a son, filling the expanded house with laughter and motion. Years later, when Isaac and Ruby's eldest daughter asked how they had met, the story of the mail-order bride delivered to the wrong Vance became a family legend, told and retold with increasing embellishment. It wasn't a mistake at all, Ruby would always conclude, her hand finding Isaac's across the table, their fingers intertwining with the ease of decades together. It was exactly where I was meant to be. And Isaac, gray now touching his temples but his eyes still bright with the love that had transformed him, would squeeze her hand in silent agreement. The rancher who hadn't touched a woman in 15 years had found in Ruby not just a wife, but redemption. Proof that even in the harshest terrain, love could take root and flourish, if only given the chance to grow.